Hey everybody, welcome to the Atheist Experience. We're so glad you could join us today. We're coming to you live from Dillahunty International Studios, where we're going to start by painting a happy little cloud. It doesn't work without the afro. I'm Matt Dillahunty. Oh, we're getting music. I'm Matt Dillahunty, and joining me this week is Tracie Harris. We've made some more changes. I'll give you some news on the studio as I have it in a minute. But yeah, we're live. Today is Sunday, August, 16th. It's right there. See, Frank has everything done. Frank has put together a pegboard with all the audio stuff. He shows up and sets it up. He's got a clock for us. It's got a date on it. And I can see him putting graphics up on the screen. Frank's the man. Woo! Anyway, it's we're live Sunday, the August 16th, 2009, from Dillahunty International Studios. As I mentioned before, this is a public access television program that's not being done at the public access studios. We're submitting the recordings so that we can go ahead and play them on public access, but we're recording it from home with whatever equipment we can manage, and you can watch it live. We are live every Sunday from 4:30 to 6 p.m. Central. That's 16:30 for those who use like the 24-hour clock. And you can do the math depending on where you are in the world, because boy, if I started announcing time zones and UTC and all this other stuff, it'd be a mess. But Frank will put the link up there, I'm sure, where you can go to, although if you're watching now, it won't make any sense because you're already watching on Ustream. But if you go to ustream.tv and look for the Atheist Experience, during that time you can watch live. You can also interact live. Normally in the studio, this is a call-in program. We are doing calls, but we're using Skype, so you'll want to go to Skype. That's skype.com. Download it, install it, set yourself up with an account, and then add Atheist TV. That's ATHEIST TV as a contact. And during the show, do not call Atheist TV. We won't answer. We can't possibly answer. And don't start sending a bunch of messages. We really appreciate, hey, thanks for doing the show and good luck and knock 'em dead, break a leg, whatever. But Joe is over there today, and he has a difficult job because he's got to manage the audio settings as well as keep track of all the callers and handle Skype and handle the music and the recording and whatever else. So send a message if you want to be a caller or a guest on the show. Send a message to Atheist TV with your name, your location, what your topic is. Keep it that simple. Joe will acknowledge it, add you to the list, and we'll try to get to as many callers as we can in whatever order seems most reasonable. In addition to this program, which is sponsored by the Atheist Community of Austin, which also sponsors an additional podcast called The Nonprofits, which is a bi-weekly, oh boy, it's difficult for me to say that today, internet audio podcast that was supposed to be on last week, but will actually be on next week. We had to adjust the schedule for a couple of reasons, so there will be a Nonprofits next week for all the people who were chomping at the bit and ready to string me up yesterday. So the Atheist Community of Austin is a nonprofit education organization promoting positive atheism and the separation of church and state. We have weekly meetings every Sunday at Romeo's on Barton Springs Road beginning at around 11:30, except for the first Sunday of the month when we host a lecture series at the Austin History Center located at the corner of 9th and Guadalupe. We are also planning the annual Bat Cruise, which will be September 26th. We'll be meeting at Threadgills on Riverside at around 5 o'clock, between 5 and 5:30. There's a parking lot behind there, One Texas Center. You can go to the ACA website, and there'll be a comment on the upper right portion of the screen for how you can go and pre-register and make sure you're taken care of. After, at 5:30, we're going to leave Threadgills and walk to the boat and go out for the normal back cruise. You can bring drinks, no glass containers, food, snacks, chit-chat, and we'll enjoy watching the bats. And then after it's over, some of us are planning on going to the 10 o'clock show at Esther's Follies on 6th Street. So we'll walk back to Threadgills and disperse, and people can grab dinner or take their cars and go do whatever they need to do. We have new goodies and equipment. See, while the public access studios in Austin are taking the summer to upgrade, we're upgrading some as well, and there's more upgrades coming in the potential future. But for the regular Nonprofits listeners who know we're using Nonprofits equipment for the Atheist Experience, who keep saying, my gosh, I don't know how many of these emails over and over again. Would you guys please buy a damn compressor? Okay, I did. So now there's a compressor, which means no matter how much I yell, it shouldn't ever break your eardrums. So we're good that way. and we're looking at some more mics and some new changes. We haven't heard a thing about when they're actually going to start training and get us back in the studio. We're still shooting for September, but we'll keep doing it from here as long as we need to do it. Well, as long as it's reasonable, because, I'd like to actually have my place back one of these days. So, what's going on, Tracie?
Not much.
You have not only stuff to talk about, but there was a young man who called in several weeks ago from Canada who was talking about going to a camp.
Right, Jesus camp.
A Jesus camp type summer camp.
Yep.
Is James right?
Yep.
Yeah. So, James, if you're out there, today would be a good day to get your Skype up and call in, because Tracie's looking forward to continuing that conversation. But I'll let you take over with whatever we're talking about, and let's get to it.
Okay. This is actually an article that ran toward the end of July in the Austin American Statesman, and it, I think, ran with a lot of Darwin celebrations that were going on is what sort of generated this article. And the topic of the article was about science and religion and, God and science. And if you're involved at all in any of that discussion, if you deal with apologetics, if you talk to apologists, you understand the problems that come up with regard to science and religion and some of the misconceptions that happen and why those things happen. And part of what I harp on a lot are media coverage of things that give a negative impression or a misrepresentation of things to the public. And usually this is done in a way that's really mild, but it's just enough to reinforce something in someone's mind. I think I've talked about ghost hunters before and programs like that, where they kind of give legitimacy to things that are pseudoscience. And people get confused about what is science and what is not. And it sounds kind of hard to believe, but in general, people don't really pay that much attention to science. And in this article, one of the things that they talked about was, let's see, it says, in his day, Darwin's theory was chastised by many as blasphemous. And Anning, it mentions a woman named Anning who had found a lot of fossils in England, and said she was unsettled by all the fossils she was finding. Even Darwin asked in one of his private notebooks, and this was interesting to me because this was said as something that Darwin said, and it was written as, who else but God could have made things happen in such a marvelous way? But what I found interesting about it is that it wasn't in quotes.
Right.
So the first thing I did was try to look up, was this a paraphrase of a different quote? Was that, what was this? What was the source and where did it come from? What did they mean by that he wrote it in his private notebook? Obviously, it's not a quote, so it's a paraphrase, and I wanted to know what it was based on.
Yeah.
But when I tried to look it up, I couldn't find a source for it. I found other articles that used this just as if it was lifted. I don't know who wrote this paragraph first, whether it appeared in this article and then was picked up elsewhere, or if it was in other articles and they picked it up here, and I don't know, what kind of credits would be required for something like that. But it appears in a few different articles as though it is inherent to those articles, but nobody really provided a source for that. So I couldn't really give any input to it or a rebuttal or offer anything because I couldn't even find where it came from. I
know there were comments like that in various journals, autobiography, etc., where that eve is discussed, and I don't think that this particular journalist misrepresents it, because they're talking about even Darwin, who came up with the theory of evolution, had at some point, at some time, and a thought like this. Who else other than God could have made things in such a marvelous way? I think that, to be fair, though, Darwin eventually answered this by realizing that if that was the way he phrased the question was wrong. That it's not a who, it's a what.
Right, but it was just, I guess, it was interesting to me that I was able to find this statement repeated, but not a source.
Right.
And like I said, that by that I don't mean to imply that there is no source or that someone misrepresented a source, but only just to say that it would be nice if when somebody paraphrases someone else and they're not giving an exact quote, that they at least provide the information that led them to paraphrase the statement in this way. The next statement that caught my attention in the article was a paragraph that said, "The still heated debate revives the question of whether science and religion can ever come together. Yet between these two fronts is a growing movement that says one can have faith in both." This is something you hear very frequently about faith in science, or some people will use the term scientism as though that's like a real thing. I don't know what that means, but what I said is, when I read this, what I thought was, you don't need faith in what's right in front of you. If you can watch a process repeatedly occur, examine it, understand the mechanisms and causes that produce it, how is that faith? Believing my brakes will work is not the same as believing that Hades rules the underworld. My brakes are a calculated risk based on experience with the brakes. Hades is an absolute unknown. I have no first-hand knowledge of Hades or the underworld, only stories. It's an extremely different thing to believe in something with which you have no experience, you cannot examine it, you know nothing about it other than what you've been told, versus believing in something that you work with literally daily. And I've had people use the brakes example repeatedly as, well, you have faith that your brakes will work on your car. And it's like, well, actually, I don't. And in fact, I went through an extended period when I lived up north where I didn't have brakes. I had to drive with my handbrake on for literally like a month. Nobody knows better than me that your brakes sometimes don't work when you get in your car. I know my brakes might not work even though they worked yesterday. I understand it. But I also understand that percentage-wise, brakes are very reliable. And unless there's something really wrong with your car, the brakes are going to work. But yes, you should always be aware that mechanical instruments can fail.
I think it's worth noting too also that this is another example of taking a term that is not well defined, that is used in a number of different contexts, and putting it in a method that makes it seem equal in usage in both contexts.
Okay.
So they're using the word faith. You ask 1,000 people what faith means, you're probably not going to get two answers that are, absolutely identical. But what I tend to look at is, what usage makes the most sense. I think what they're trying to do here, and this happens a lot, like I mentioned before, how, for example, and I can pull examples right from his book, where Ray Comfort uses the word logic when it's clear that he means common sense. And having gone back and watched some of Star Trek, the original series, there are times when Spock's character also uses the word logic as common sense. It drives me nuts because it's something that the character, you would think, should know better,
right,
etc. And here's another example of the term faith being used to say, I have faith in God and I have faith in science and I can have both. Well, what you mean when you say faith in God is not the same thing that you mean when you say faith in science. And on the one hand, when you say faith in science, which if you want to use that term, I don't use that terminology myself because I'd prefer to avoid the confusion. But I understand that, by and large, most people would use phrases like that. I have faith in science. I have faith the sun's going to come up. I have faith in my brakes. Right. And what you really mean is that you trust that these things are going to occur based on your past experiences, based on reliable, consistent evidence about how the world works. And when you say you have faith in God, it's possible that there are some people who mean the same thing, that for example, they have convinced themselves that they have reliable, consistent, evidence for the existence of God. But this is something that would definitely be unique to that individual and not necessarily shared. We all have understanding of how reality works and how you can look at and find out how brakes works. The idea that you have faith in God, I've said, others have said that, faith is believing something ain't so, and faith is the reason people give. when they don't have a good reason. I think faith is the placeholder answer that people stick in when they don't have an answer that they know should be accepted based on reason. And so I think, and this is going to come up several times, that there is a conflict between faith as it's best meant, or most useful in terminology, and reason. And when you say I have faith in science, that is a reasoned faith that is not the same thing.
Yeah, I would agree. And it's interesting because one of the notes I had made, there's a columnist who prints a column in the Statesman pretty often. His name is Leonard Pitts. And he writes mainly on racist issues in America. But one of his columns recently, he mentioned some of the ways that racism is being thrown around, the term racism. And he was saying that there are certain people who are, I guess, upset that they're being labeled racist. And so what they've started doing is labeling other things racist that really aren't racist, that he would say are not racist things, in order to water down the phrase. And so he's saying what they're doing is making an attempt to say, well, this over here is also racist, and that over there is also racist. Yeah. And the idea is everybody's so racist that, what does it mean when you call me racist? It doesn't mean anything.
On the racist front, I've actually had that same example, only it was used as bigotry. In an email this week, and a lot of it has to do with this idea. You hear people say, "Well, you're censoring me," or "You're intolerant."
Right.
Well, okay, maybe I am censoring you. I don't necessarily think that censorship is a bad thing. I don't think that discrimination is a bad thing, and I don't think that intolerance is a bad thing, provided that we are discriminating against bad ideas, junk science, pseudoscience. I don't think that intolerance is a bad idea if I am intolerant of bad, harmful ideas. There's a difference between that and being intolerant of somebody else and somebody else's rights to their beliefs. I can still be intolerant of their actions. All of those things are things that I think are good. And so when people start to realize that, and they say, well, you say, well, no, you are practicing an irrational discrimination, a bigotry. And they say, well, you discriminate all the time too. Yeah, I do. But that's not the same thing.
Right. And that's what Pitts was pointing out, was just that, you take a person that's really racist, and then they start labeling people who are making statements where they identify maybe a racial issue, but they're not using it in a racist way.
Right.
And so he's saying, this is a tactic where somebody tries to destroy the meaning of a word and make it almost meaningless to where you become unable to use it. And I find that becomes the situation with faith when somebody pairs two things like you're describing, where one is completely different than the other. The reasons for your belief in the one are completely justified. Your reasons for the belief in the other are not justified, and you're saying that it's just belief. It's all just belief. And it's like, well, is it a justified? There's a difference between a justified belief and an unjustified belief. It's, yes, you can call them both belief, but, one you have a reason for, one you don't. And that's an important differentiation that shouldn't be just swept aside like it doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing we'll hit later maybe with exist. And I've pointed that out, that people take that term and they abuse it and stretch it and just torture it to death until, basically the term means nothing, and it means nothing to exist. And if you have to take a word like exist and utterly just pummel it and destroy it so that you can then say, my God exists, I'm not impressed with that. It doesn't impress me when your argument for the existence of God boils down to existence doesn't mean anything. That's not an argument. That's just destroying a term. I mean, and I do understand that when you philosophically begin to look at definitions, sometimes you can really, dissect terms and say, what are these meanings? And it does get a little bit bogged down, and sometimes things aren't as cut and dry as, in black and white as they seem. And I get that. But when it comes to a point to where you have to get to the bottom of it, which is this word is meaningless in my argument for the existence of God, existence means nothing, then why are you even saying God exists if your argument boils down to existence is a term that doesn't have any meaning?
Well, yeah, we use linguistic shortcuts. Matter of fact, you could say that all language is shortcuts because you're expressing an idea in a more potentially more simple way. So we use linguistic shortcuts all the time, and it's absolutely fine. It's normal. It's perfect. It's one of the most beautiful things that we've ever been able to do, provided you and I have the same understanding of what the word means.
Sure.
If that's not the case, then linguistic shortcuts impede communication. And for people who, might think, well, gosh, these guys are, for example, in this case, droning on and on and on forever, talking about the minutia of, or when they laughed at Clinton for what is mean, or what is, or
right.
That type of thing. It's because it matters. And the more you allow these linguistic shortcuts to slide by in an inappropriate context, the more likely you are to make them useless for effective communication. Meaning, we've either got to come up with new terms, and some of us would have to sit here and be pedantic about things, or argue for an hour about what we mean by transcendent or whatever.
Right. Let's see. The next thing that caught my attention was they said that in the article, evolutionary biologist Francisco, I think it's
Ayala.
Let's see, has repeatedly argued that the Genesis story not be seen as a scientific treatise on the origin of the universe, but rather as a declaration of God's sovereignty over his creation. When asked whether God exists, as you say, Ayala? Okay, I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with that term. Says he cannot prove or disprove that, arguing that the question is not one of science, but one of religion. And this was the most disappointing answer that I could have read.
Yeah.
Especially from an evolutionary biologist and from anybody that works in science. I can't believe that they would say that the existence of any item would be outside the realm of science to answer.
And yet this is insanely common. And, you've
it's
got people like
common.
Francis Collins, and we talked about Francis Collins a couple times in the last couple nonprofits. This is his view as well.
Well, I would expect it from a theist. I really really expect it from a theist to say something like this, because they will say things to defend that belief.
Well, I don't know whether or not Ayala qualifies as a theist or not, but I will say that you have, this is in part the invention of a non-theist, Stephen Jay Gould. This non-overlapping magisteria, that science answers one type of question and religion answers a different type of question, and never the two shall meet, that they are supreme in their own bailiwicks. And so you get this kind of hands-off approach where scientists say, well, that's a religion question, we can't address it. Okay. I completely disagree, but you've got points on there to get to, so go ahead.
Oh, sure, yeah. I just put, what a horrible response. While it's true that without specifics, we can't prove or disprove the existence of any item X. So in other words, if we're in the abstract being asked a question like, does God exist, with no specifics concerning God, that question is unanswerable because it's a nonsense question. The reason is we don't have a claim of existence until we have something specific about the item. So in other words, if I don't know what you're claiming exists, if you have not defined what it is that you're saying exists, no one can answer whether or not it does exist. We have to know what it is we're looking for in order to say, yes, it's there. Saying X exists where X is not defined isn't claiming that something exists. The reason is not, and when I say the reason, it's that it cannot be proved or disproved. The reason is not that establishing if items exist is beyond the scope of science. Either the word exist means something or it does not. If it's true that we cannot establish item X is actually there, what that means is that we cannot say item X exists, and that we must acknowledge that to the best of our ability to discern, the item is indistinguishable from nothing, which places it squarely outside the only meaningful category of existent items until such time as we can find a way to distinguish it from nothing.
There's a couple of problems with this whole thing where he points out that he can't prove or disprove. First of all, I'm disappointed that you have a scientist. All the time I get letters from scientists saying, scientists never talk in the terms of prove or disprove. Right. Well, okay. Somebody sent a letter to this guy because this guy does. And yes, I understand that it's a mathematical term, but he's probably just speaking colloquially. And it would be much better, regardless of whether he said used the prove or not, he should have just stopped as "we can't prove that," or if he wasn't going to use that word, that can't be demonstrated,
correct,
or has not been demonstrated.
Right.
I think it may be wrong to say what could or couldn't
right.
be demonstrated ahead of time, and leave off the second half of
right.
prove or disprove, or demonstrate, or we can't demonstrate that it's false.
It's
because what that does is it gives the impression that we cannot demonstrate that this is true, and we can't demonstrate that it is false, and therefore it's 50-50. That's the impression that it gives, that this is hands off, which isn't necessarily true, that it ignores where the actual burden of proof lies, and that's with the claimant.
Sure.
It's a way of this kind of it's an insincere attempt to make room for the fact that we have people who believe things for no good reason.
Right.
It's, hey, I'm busy doing science. I'd rather not piss you off by telling you that what you're claiming is vague, and you haven't demonstrated anything for it. And I would rather say that I can't disprove that and you can't prove it, so that you don't feel so silly about accepting this delusion without
right.
evidential support.
I mean, even James Randi, who doesn't love James Randi, but I remember the day that he announced that he was going to start including religion in his skeptical realm.
I remember that day too, because it's one of the reasons that I'm actually an atheist now.
Really?
Yeah. I'd been a fan of Randy.
I emailed him when he did that, and I just said, thank you for including this now, because it needs to be included.
Yeah, I'd been a fan of Randy's and reading Swift, and I was already either an atheist or approaching, acknowledging, accepting that. And it's when he decided to do that, granted, he hasn't gone all out. It's not like he's launched an attack on religion. But when he decided that he was not going to ignore that particular subject.
Not to give it immunity.
All of a sudden, there were links to follow to other links to follow to other links, and it was a beautiful thing.
Yeah. Let's see. So then the next thing that caught my attention was Simon Conway Morris, a paleontologist at Cambridge University, also argues that science and religion are compatible. Conway Morris emphasizes that developments happen as a result of pre-existing conditions, such as the need for blood cells to have hemoglobin in order to transport oxygen. Evolution, therefore, works only because it plays out within a certain set of rules.
What does that have to do with science and religion being compatible?
If that is confusing, it should be. Let's see. He says evolution isn't accidental, as one might suspect. And I don't know who suspects it's accidental. But in his opinion, if evolution began all over again, human intelligence would develop pretty much the same way as it has. It goes on like this in the paragraph. And this is disturbing to me. And I actually did a blog post at the AE blog talking about a conversation I had with a gentleman who's a naturalist in a lot of ways, but surprisingly has believes in God, and he talks a lot about nature, and he understands nature, and he does hybrid plants, and he does all these things using nature, and yet in his when you talk to him, he'll come out and say, how can you see this and not believe in God? And I'm thinking, how can you see it and not believe in nature? And when this is what I had to say about that. Rules that exist in the natural world, when it says, because it plays out within a certain set of rules in that paragraph, I'm saying those are rules that exist in the natural world.
Yeah.
Nature appears to have parameters. Why then wouldn't someone believe what they see, that nature can have parameters? To say a God must set those parameters is no different than looking at the parameters of nature and claiming they're impossible. That's exactly what you're doing. You're looking at the way nature works. You're looking at an acorn grow into an oak tree, and you're saying, that's impossible. That cannot happen.
Unless there is some
supernature,
must
do it, because nature can't do that. And I'm saying, I look at nature do it, and I say, well, nature just did it, and you saw it do it. And you're sitting here telling me that it can't? I don't understand that.
This falls into the category, and he's talking about how science and religion are compatible. I think that is another weasel word there. In my view, They're not compatible. It is possible for an individual, and Francis Collins comes up because we talked about him recently, and I think it's a good example of that, to accept the findings of science, the rigors of scientific principles, the process to work as a scientist, and then, in addition to all of that, have some God belief where that they've glommed on as an extra entity or transcendent, or I'm sticking it in these holes. And it's possible for them to do that, provided that this God never gets in the way of the expansion of knowledge of what we're going to learn from the rigors of science. And in that sense, it is possible for an individual to simultaneously hold two beliefs because they have a rationalization mechanism that doesn't make them contradictory, because their views of God are what I termed with Francis Collins science plus, and the specific aspects of what they believe and are claiming with regard to God transcend what we currently understand with science. I don't think they all do it very well. I think that what we find is that by and large, you're going to come in conflict at some point. And which one wins out, the science aspect of your mind or the God aspect of your mind, it kind of tells us a lot about, who you are, et cetera, and what you really are willing to accept. But the idea that they're compatible is one that I think is, it's a word trick. They're not compatible in any sense other than if there is a God, it should be demonstrable when I say using the rigors of science, I don't mean that we could put God in a beaker. I'm saying that the methodology that we use to determine whether anything else exists should apply to anything that exists, including your God or whatever supernatural thing you happen to actually believe in. And so I think they are in conflict. I also don't buy into the non-overlapping magisteria that tries to separate them, and I definitely don't buy into this idea that one answers how questions and the other answers why questions. That to me is one of the most asinine word games anybody has ever played. Where both are attempting to answer questions about what is, and whether you phrase that as a how or a why or a what or a where or a who doesn't matter. Give me an example of a how question or a why question that you think is explicitly within the domain of science or religion, and I'll rephrase that question and put it promptly in the category of the other one. It's insane that we do this. Oh, science tells us how, but religion tells us why. No, it doesn't. Religion asserts meaning onto the explanations.
The thing is, you either have something that's manifesting or you don't.
Yeah.
And if it manifests, you have something to examine. And if it's not manifesting, you have nothing.
Yep.
I mean, I don't know how else to describe that. There's either nothing there or there's something there. If there's something there, then you can examine it. And if you have nothing to examine, that's nothing. I don't know why that's hard.
I don't either.
Okay, so then let's see. We had Peter Hess, I guess, the Faith Project Director at the National Center for Science Education in Oakland, California, also says that scientific inquiry and religious belief are not mutually exclusive.
Now that phrasing, I think I just agreed with.
He says
scientific inquiry and religious belief are not mutually exclusive. And I would accept that because I know people, and like Francis Collins, who have scientific belief, or an application of scientific inquiry, and exercise it, and have religious belief. I just think that it's the position of here's all the things that we know, and I'm going to keep God out here in the unknown area. And then as the things we know increase, that unknown gets smaller, and the areas to plug your God in get erased.
This reminds me, just came to me while I was dropping my pen. While I was doing this, while you were talking about the different realms of science and religion and the idea that they're not different, I remembered a professor who wrote to us on the atheist list, on the TV list, and wrote about a student of his. He was teaching in the sciences, and she found that the teachings were incompatible with her religious beliefs.
Yeah.
And she was having a struggle with that, and ultimately she withdrew from the program. That was her response, to say, I have to stick with my religion, and so I refuse to learn any more about this.
And that's not the only case of that happening. If you listen to like Kent Hovind's lectures and other people, it's gone. There's a monster in the couch that eats pens and coins, small coins.
I'm scared.
But there were examples of people who, I'm in the field of geology, for example, and when there's a mountain of evidence that is overwhelming to show the age of the Earth is much greater than these 6,000 to 10,000 years that the individual's particular religious beliefs claim, they've dropped the program. And there was one guy who actually attained a doctorate in geology, or was a doctoral candidate in geology, despite being a young Earth creationist. And the reason that he went ahead and went through with it was so that now young Earth creationists would have a PhD geologist that they could reference, even though, when he's actually working, if that's the right word, for the creationists, anything he says is no longer science. It no longer has anything to do with what he, learned and studied during his geology courses. It's like, saying I'm gonna get an economics degree so that I can, run a better pyramid scheme.
Well, it's like John Mack advocating for the UFO abductees. Yeah. They get a Harvard professor. Okay. Okay, a Harvard professor believes it. What are you gonna do? There's one.
Yeah.
So.
But that's the thing, is that we don't necessarily tally up. The neither the number of people believe a thing nor the strength of their conviction has anything to do with whether or not what they believe is true.
That is true, because they might be being abducted and we just haven't demonstrated it yet. John Max had a handle on it. Anyway, Peter Hess said that denying science is a profoundly unsound theological position.
Amen.
Science, and this is a person who's, just to remind you, since we had that little break, but he's the Faith Project Director at the National Center for Science Education in Oakland, California. And
now, this next statement I actually like.
He says, science and faith are but two ways of searching for the same truths.
I completely agree. And the reason that I love this thing so much is that it goes against NOMA and it goes against all these other claims that they're looking for different things or different explanations. It's nonsense. Science and faith, in the religious sense, are two ways of searching for the same truths. And the difference is that science finds them and faith asserts them. That's the difference.
Right.
Science, the scientific method, the processes, the application of logic and reason and evidential standards, that is the single most reliable, consistently reliable way of learning about the universe. As a matter of fact, nobody else has even demonstrated that some other way of knowing or way of discovering reality could be anywhere near as good or reliable. And if they were to do so, they'd have to use science as the initial standard. There's a reason that we talk about ages ago, the logical absolutes and how they are the cornerstone upon which we build all this stuff that gets to here. That doesn't mean that science is foolproof, that we don't make mistakes, that our methods are godlike. That's not the case at all. It's just about, if you want to learn about reality, how do you go about doing it? Which method of discovery has the best results? Which method of investigation yields the most consistently reliable results?
Right.
And between those two methods, and I scoff mildly at the religion faith method because science is the clear winner, but where science actually does demonstrate this, religion and I won't put that one back, but religion demonstrates nothing. If anything, it comes out exactly as we'd expect from chance, by and large.
It reminds me of one of the letters we got recently where somebody wrote in and said, "What do you think about the God of Joseph Campbell?" And he said, "What do you think about his statements on God?" And I said, "I don't have a problem with Joseph Campbell because Campbell says these are myths. He says these are symbols." And they are. So, and one of the examples that I used when I wrote back was, you have this event. People look up and they see the sun start over here and end over here.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a day. And they don't understand what they're looking at.
Right.
And so they say, that is Apollo driving a fiery chariot across the sky. And in the meantime, it's going to help us out because there's this set of stars over here, and that's Apollo. And if you're sailing the sea and you need to navigate the stars, and there's all these little stories to help you remember where the stars are, that's extremely helpful.
Yep.
So you have this myth that says that you tell the kid, there goes Apollo, there he is, you see him floating across the sky. And that's a myth. It's not really an explanation. It's a story. Now, whether or not people literally believe it or understand it's a story is irrelevant in the sense of it's just a story. It doesn't matter if you believe it's true. But in the reality, in the pragmatic reality that I have to live in a world with some people that believe it's true and some people don't understand it's just a story, that does become important. So yeah, I understand that. But that is not an explanation for what's happening with regard to what people are seeing with the sun. It's a story to help people sort of frame it into something that they can understand in a reality where they really don't understand what it is they're looking at, where they don't understand this is a giant star that the planet is circling.
Yeah. And the other thing is, of course, as we gradually increase our understanding of that, the next thing is that, okay, there's this ball of light that's not necessarily Apollo, and it's going around us. And then later on, we find out that that's not the case, that we're actually going around it, but because of the right. But anyway, you were talking about, the inability to understand things and to make up stories and stuff that go along. And I had an example. For the and I hate to just pick on Christians, so for the Muslims sitting out there who would scoff at these ancient people who came up with stories about Apollo or Zeus. Let me just stick with Zeus for a second. You would scoff at the ignorance of humanity to think that lightning bolts are actually being plunged
hurled
down by Zeus. Okay, those are the early days of religion. And when religion comes in conflict with the discoveries of science, with the increase of our understanding about reality, one of a couple different things can happen. The religions fall by the wayside and are no longer worshipped because they are clearly wrong, or the religions are adopt changes, they're adapted, modified, and if you follow that trend of change, what you'll find is that the claims that religion make become increasingly more vague, increasingly harder to pin down, increasingly useless to the individuals. It becomes nothing more than personal feelings or a personal relationship with Allah or Jesus or whatever. And so, but you could, and I know that there are some people out there who claim that, we worship the ancient Greek gods, and okay, sure you do. But you could say, Zeus does hurl lightning bolts. It doesn't matter that you found a scientific explanation about static electricity in moisture evaporated in the air and that this produces lightning. That is the process that Zeus uses. And when you Christians, especially you anti-science, anti-evolution, anti-reality, fundamentalist, literalist, young earth creationist buffoons come out and try to shift a little bit. You've realized that now your stance is so rigid you can't possibly ever say it and be accepted in any kind of reasoned culture. And so you want to shift more to this Christian moderate or this theistic moderate that says, well, okay, we have good science that, evolution occurs, but only macroevolution and not microevolution, or evolution is the process that God used. You sound just as stupid as if somebody said that the static electricity that forms lightning is the process that Zeus uses to hurl lightning bolts.
Well, it's exactly the same thing. Yeah. And actually, one of the things I've started doing is I used to use fairies in conversations with people that would write in, and and sometimes people would get offended, but really the only reason I would latch onto something like a fairy was because I wanted to use something that everyone could pretty much in a consensus fashion say, we agree this thing doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Because that's a way to say, okay, let's take something I know you know doesn't exist, like a fairy, and let's say I used your argument to demonstrate that this fairy exists. Would it seem reasonable to you?
Curiously, that only works relatively recently anyway, since people like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle actually bought into the idea of fairies, the Cottingley fairies.
Well, they had photos.
Yeah.
So what are you going to do? I mean, but yeah, and so with that, somebody had talked about explanatory function a little bit, which I would agree with you that saying God did it isn't really much of an explanation. It's like the Apollo drives the chariot. It's not an explanation. But if you want to say that I attribute, natural function to God as the source of that, I went ahead and said, well, let's drop fairies in that case, because I used to use fairies making the flowers bloom, but I just went with gremlins, because gremlins do have a pretty much culturally accepted little explanatory function behind them. They cause mechanisms to malfunction. That is what a gremlin is. So gremlins are the explanation for an piece of equipment malfunctioning. This is why it messes up. So now what I do is I plug in a gremlin, because it's kind of more of a closer analogy for some people. And so I skipped the next page. I went straight to this one because I think it's just a little bit more interesting. Let's see. Yeah, they talked about, it says, Michael Zimmerman, a biology professor at Butler University in Indianapolis, said his work with the Clergy Letter Project, a group of academics and ministers seeking to show that science and religion are compatible, has led him to believe that a vast number of religious leaders of all denominations are fully comfortable with science. He argues that religious fundamentalists are the exception and that they tend to assert themselves more aggressively to maintain their waning influence. And I have to point out, I was a little confused, I guess, by this paragraph, because he starts out saying that the vast number of religious leaders of all denominations are fully comfortable with science.
Right.
But in the second part, he says, or I'm sorry, I keep saying he, but it's actually a woman that wrote the article. So she says, he argues that religious fundamentalists, now I don't know by that if we're still talking about fundamentalist leaders or fundamentalists in general, but I initially took it to mean fundamentalists in general, are the exception, and that they tend to assert themselves more aggressively to maintain their waning influence. So the claim here is that religious leaders, at least, would be are comfortable with science, and that it's just a minority of religious people who have this issue with science because it's incompatible with their fundamentalist religion. However, the article does go on to talk about the masses of religious people who are not religious leaders,
Right.
and demonstrates that they fully do not accept science in general.
It's a disparity between what the pastor is thinking versus what the parishioners are thinking.
If the stats they're using are correct.
Yeah.
And it's hard to tell because some of these groups that they're using are like coming from Oxford and coming, so it's like European.
And it's also different polls.
Right, and so it makes a difference if you're in Europe or if you're in America, because in the page that I just skipped over, they talk about the numbers of scientists at Oxford and Cambridge being more theistic than the general population.
Yeah.
In the United States, that's flip-flopped.
Curiously, I don't find it very surprising at all to think that there'd be a disparity between from the pulpit to the pew on issues of science. One, because the preachers don't bother preaching about science or teaching science, and number two, it's not the only disparity. If you actually get into matters of theology and matters of religion, what the person behind the pulpit knows, understands, and believes is not necessarily, as a matter of fact, it's often going to be quite different from what the person that he's talking to knows, understands, and believes. And
I think a lot of times the guy in the pulpit knows that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And they specifically avoid. Jeff Dees talked about how his parents, having gone, to seminary and learned many of the objections he has, we're kind of in the position that we don't talk about that from the pulpit because those people aren't ready for it.
Right.
Holy crap. I mean, and I just finished reading Bart Ehrman's new book, Jesus Interrupted, where he talks about, seminary students going in, initially learning the Bible from a historical critical perspective. And so any of your preachers who went to a decent seminary, they know the things
Yeah, that are historically
that are
problematic.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And they're not going to talk about them.
No, they don't.
And it's for two reasons. One, they understand that to the uneducated, it's damning to a lot of the claims they make. And two, they understand that even to the educated, to the educated as well, it is damning. That they don't have any better answers for this than anybody else. And
Right.
if they were to admit and talk about what they know to be contradictions in core beliefs, in doctrine, in orthodoxy, in the process of developing a religion, in the way religion and religious views have changed over time, in the original, kind of hetero-orthodox views, in the various heretical views that were stamped out and obliterated or hidden away or killed. If they talked about that, then all of a sudden they couldn't just walk in and say, "How's everybody doing this morning? Isn't it a wonderful morning that God has given to us? Isn't Jesus good to you? Don't you just want to love him and praise him? Could you please open your hymnal to number 138 and then have a good time?" Because that's what they do.
Right.
It's a social experience by and large, where you don't actually learn anything. You go there to listen to platitudes and get reinforcement for the beliefs that already aren't justified. You have a bunch of unjustified beliefs, and instead of justifying them with evidence and reason, you are instead going to a reinforcement clinic to have them reinforced by repetition, by community hive-mindedness. Oh, look at all these other people who believe, and they're just like me. And that's how we end up with a president that people think is just like me. I don't want a president that's just like you. But anyway. Do we want to, it's like 20 after. We want to pause for some calls?
Do we have calls?
Oh, yeah, we got calls. We had calls waiting since before the show started.
Sure.
If I could just get a quick one of y'all do a quick announcement. Ustream is being real squirrely, so some people can't see the stream.
Okay.
Hopefully, after the show, so after 6, hopefully a recording will pop up on Ustream. They can watch the show.
Okay.
If not, we'll have a thing on play.
So a couple of quick announcements. One, Ustream is being finicky and giving some people problems. Hopefully after the show's over, there'll be a recorded version up that you can watch after the show's over. If you're one of the ones that's been having problems, you can go ahead and queue up the next call.
Do you want to skip to James first?
That would be
good. Go ahead and we'll take James first, and then whoever I had first on the list before. As a reminder, after the show's over, everybody gets together for dinner. And it used to be we'd go to Threadgill's when we were downtown. We forgot to tell Threadgill's we weren't coming, and they kept right on preparing a place for us. And so our apologies. And as soon as we're back in the studio in September, we'll resume at Threadgill's. And they've also politely offered to help us out a little on the day of the Bat Cruise as a meeting place, etc. But right now we're going to Pluckers at Lakeline Mall. Okay. It's at Pecan Park or Pecan Creek Boulevard, and
Pecan Park.
There it is, 11066 Pecan Park. It's right there at Pecan Park and 620. Also, I forgot to mention, Thursday's happy hour has moved. We are no longer at the Dog and Duck. We are going to the Flying Saucer, which is right at the Y between Lamar and Guadalupe, where it forks.
Wow.
So it's not hard to find. It's a pretty good spot. They got like 200 different beers, and you can enjoy that. But we got James on the line. How you doing?
Oh. Hi.
You're unmuted, my friend.
Thank you. Hi, Tracie.
Hey.
I'm back.
How was Jesus Camp?
Yeah, I called in last, I guess it was 5 weeks ago now, with Dawn on the show. I was the last caller, actually, last week, and there wasn't enough time. But I had quite an experience there.
Do tell.
I was there. I wasn't there for the entire week, 7 days, but I was there for 5 of the 7 days. And
Hey, I'm going to be rude and get up, but I'm still listening. We got an audio problem I need to look at.
All right. I got quite a bit of footage, which I put up on my YouTube channel, which of course I'm going to quickly plug. I sent it in through Skype. It's SHWANERD. That's my username.
Okay.
And it wasn't too much of a surprise for me, in all honesty, because I've gone, I've gone about 16 years in a row at least now. And this camp was just specifically for teenagers. A lot of the stuff was more of a reinforcement of previously indoctrinated beliefs, I guess, that they start at the typical Jesus camp age. Because I was there in like kindergarten,
Oh,
and
wow.
they work up from there.
So this was your second time going?
No, this was my second time going as an atheist. I've gone for 15 years.
Oh, wow.
And was a fundamentalist until I was about 13 or 14.
Okay.
Yeah. Then I said on the other show, I went on YouTube and started looking up videos because I wanted to, be able to debate with atheists, and I wanted to be able to prove them wrong.
Sure.
And it didn't really work out that way. It kind of went the other way for me.
That's what happened to me.
Yeah. But yeah, I had to, of course, remain in the closet. I have still been that way for the last 2 years, except for friends, of course, but nobody at the camp knew. They all know me, so they treated me just the same, and I had to kind of put on a cover. But then again, I knew exactly how to do it since I've been a fundamentalist.
Plenty of practice.
Majority of my, yeah. It was alarming how easy it was for me to just put on the face and pretend I wasn't disgusted by it. It was actually quite horrible there.
Wow.
I didn't notice how bad it was, and still I'm able to tolerate it, I think, much better than a lot of people.
Sure.
I've put several 10-minute videos up on YouTube about it, and most people can't make it through 10 minutes. And I had about 4 hours every day for 5 days of the same stuff.
Do us a quick favor and give us the channel, spell it out, and I'll have Frank add it to the graphics here for people who want to go watch what you recorded at camp.
It's Schwanerd. It's for my hometown. It's SHWANERD.
SHWANERD.
Yes, I've put up about, I think, 5 videos now, roughly about 10 minutes long. Mostly it's of the messages from the pastors, and I got several of the calls they did to do your offerings and tithes, because even though they're only teenagers, they of course ask for money. They even actually do it with the younger aged kids. I remember being about 8 or 9 years old, and then the buckets come by, and they still take money from children, which is.
You know what? I remember just vaguely when I used to go. And by the way, you realize, of course, that by putting these up here, there's a good chance that somebody who went to that camp is going to figure out who shot that video.
I didn't give any information as to where the camp is in any of the videos, and I did distort the video in most of them so that you can't see who it is.
Okay.
I know.
Let me tell you, you put stuff up on the internet, people are going to find it. I can guarantee it happens. I can tell you about it. My girlfriend can tell you about it. People you wouldn't expect are going to find it.
I've been taking so many risks. Last time I called in, I was alone in my house. My mom is just upstairs right now.
Was she running the vacuum?
No, she thinks I'm doing a blog TV or something.
Okay, there was some kind of hiss. I can tell you though, when you were talking about the offering stuff, I don't remember very many specifics. I went to Camp Windermere, Lake of the Ozarks, for most of my youth. Matter of fact, I've still got. I evidently went all the way to my right before my senior year, or right at my senior year of high school, which I didn't remember it that way. I remembered that I stopped going before then, but I've got a Windermere 87 thing in my Bible. I don't remember specifically how they did offerings and stuff. It strikes me as odd that perhaps you'd send your young kid off to summer camp, and in addition to the clothes and the miscellaneous stuff that you need to pack and bug spray and stuff, you also need to give them
$300 to go for the week. That's the cost of the program.
Yeah, and then you also need to send them with cash. I remember that we were sent with cash specifically so that we could buy some candy or,
Exactly.
a soft drink, or that we could, rent one of the boats that cost $1 a day or something down there. So you had this money that was your allotment, and I'm assuming that my parents included additional money that was for offerings. So do you have to sit around and budget with the money you've got as to, am I going to put some in the offering plate today, or am I going to wait till like the end of camp and put whatever's left in the offering plate? Or, are they going to try and guilt me out of my candy bar money?
Oh, yeah. I used to do that all the time. I got guilted out of candy bars a couple times.
I can definitely remember being guilted out of money that I wanted to spend on something else.
They use horrible analogies, though, too. I think one of the nights they started with them talking about a birthday for their son, and then acting like we need to give just not because of what God's done, but for just who he is. And, you give stuff to people on their birthday just because of who they are and because you love them. And, it was kind of disconcerting to see the approval that they got for that. I thought at least they'd be a bit, hesitant to give away their money, but I saw lots of big bills going in there even.
Yeah.
And
I can tell you this, though. I can tell you this. If I had somebody and I had gotten them some birthday presents and I didn't hear from them ever, not a thank you, not a phone call, not a letter, not a dinner, whatever, eventually they're going to stop getting presents from me.
Yeah. Unfortunately, at this camp this year for me, I didn't see too much proselytizing, because the format for this place is you send the kids when they're younger, and that's where the major indoctrination starts. And by the time you're the age I am, I actually just turned 17 in July, they basically expect that you already agree with most of the stuff they're already going to say, so they don't have to convince you of anything anymore.
Yeah, it's not proselytizing. It's all about revival and rededicating your life and,
exactly.
And showing that you've been a reprobate over the last year and not been as good to God as you should have been.
That's exactly what it was like. And a lot of stuff with, because it's a Pentecostal camp, a major focus is on getting them to speak in tongues, which was, I freely admit, hilarious.
Did you speak in tongues?
I think actually I did when I was around 12 or 13 years old. I can't do it anymore. I don't think I could even bring myself to do it anymore.
Oh, come on now. At 12 you were able to fake it? You can't fake it now?
No, I can't. Not nearly. I can't even do the whole rolling of the tongue thing anymore. I lost all those exotic inflections.
Not going to get as many dates as you thought you were.
Yeah.
Hey, let me just ask you, in your experience with these kids at the camp, at the age that they're at now, like getting to be, older teenagers, do you find that there's any disparity? Like, did you, I remember when I was hitting that age, when I was in church, there was a real disparity between certain kids that were like super believing and super into it, where you just knew this person was totally into it. And then there'd be other people that you just knew that as soon as they got out of there, they were going to go roll a joint. Is the camp mainly just like crazy people who believe it and they're just all out for it, or would they just be faking it so you couldn't tell? Or do you get an impression that the kids ever get real, like afterwards or late at night or something, when it's just the kids? Do you ever get a feel for who's...
Well, I don't know. I didn't share this last time because I thought it might be kind of inappropriate, but it's something that is, I think, a perfect answer to that question. Last year, in the summertime, at the camp, of course, I was walking down the road past the girls' cabins, and I noticed something on the front lawn, and I didn't know what it was at first, and I went over to it, and I looked down, and it was something the last thing I think I could have ever expected at that camp. It was not a joint. It was not a condom. I'm looking at the chat here on the stream. Damn. It was a strap-on.
Nice!
Whoa!
Quite a large one, I may admit, since I already said it. Outside the girls' cabins.
That's beautiful.
Wow.
So they must have been doing it outside or something and left it there, and I missed it. But
I bet they chucked it out the window when they woke up the other girls.
Did you get some footage?
Yeah, things I missed out on.
That's
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah, that was a big O. Henry ending to that story.
Yeah, but besides that, even though I just dropped that bomb, I, for the most part, the impression I got from people this year, there are some who sit at the back and they don't get as involved as other kids, but they're still pretty straight edge, I guess.
Okay.
I haven't found anything at all that could compare to last year.
See,
But,
and to kind of, I'm going to answer the same question as well, because I'm still friends with some of the people that I was in a church youth group with. Some of them don't want to have anything to do with me anymore, and that's understandable, and that's their prerogative, and I don't hold anything against them. But I was friends with quite a lot of them, and I can say for sure that at youth events, whether it was camp or something else or any kind of revival, you'd work everybody up, and everybody would participate because they're still part of that same youth group, and you'd have people crying and hugging, and people who didn't get along would, hug and do the thing, and everybody would get around, and it would be a big Jesus love. And then even by that night, when people went back to their cabins or whatever, everybody already knew, by and large, what was going to happen. And you and your best friend would be talking about, did you see so and so praising and worshiping? I really hope this time it sticks, but it never really has, because she's been out doing the hoogie watts. She's been using that strap on type thing. But you knew who was going to go out and be exactly what they were before, by and large, over and over again. And I don't think any of it's been any kind of indicator for success or rationality or even religiosity in future life. It's kind of the reason I think that camps like this and particularly the indoctrination of children is so dangerous is because some kids you're not going to change. Some kids are going to find their way free no matter what, and some kids are going to probably be batshit crazy no matter what. Yeah. But the ones in the middle, the ones that could go either way, that's where I think we're doing a huge disservice. And as long as that's the case, I have to be opposed to stuff like this, even though I participated.
Yeah, for the most part, I found that I do have some close friends there from the camp, because we always were in our little group every year. I wanted to compare my memories of them when we were younger to how they are now, and see, if they've changed much. Well, they are more mature and everything, except for some instances. I usually don't use swearing or anything typically, unless I'm on the internet or not in public or polite conversation. But still, sometimes something will slip out. But I noticed at the camp they had a little thing going where if ever any one of them swore, they'd get punched in the arm by the other kid. So they were trying to be really, really
that only make me swear more. What the hell are you doing hitting me?
I had some bruises on my arm afterwards, but they also I actually talked a little bit to one of my friends about secular music. He told me about how the church he goes to back home was always ranting about you should never listen to secular music because garbage in, garbage out. And I told him, well, actually, I like to listen to some secular music like Motorhead, and I tried to drop some names of things where they have some particularly anti-religious songs, but I didn't mention them. And he was kind of alarmed, but I couldn't help it. He listens to like Christian rap, and I was like, how is that possible?
Just tell him, the other night I was listening to this old vinyl LP of the Dayglow Abortions, and it was just awesome.
Yeah, I'm sure he would just love that. But that was the biggest difficulty I think it was for me this year, because I was utterly alone. I didn't find a single person I think that I could have confided in. I basically had to keep my thoughts and most of what I wanted to say to myself for 5 days. Because I was either with, of course, the other children, or back at my own trailer with my mother, who is obviously a fundamentalist. So, kind of kept it to myself.
Well, do what you can, getting more videos up, and maybe even if you want to, I don't know, if you've got maybe some blog posts. I'm sure Tracie would probably be happy to take some email discussions with you with your comments on the camp and get them up on the Atheist Experience blog. But I mean, if you've got one more comment you wanted to get in, that's fine. I just wanted to make sure we move on to all
Yes.
the people who are waiting.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. And yes, me and Tracie have emailed back and forth a little bit. So I guess that would be great if we could do that sort of interview type thing through
absolutely.
the emails and the interwebs and stuff. And thanks so much for having me. And see you all later.
All right,
Thanks for the
thank
report,
you.
James. I love the way I can. This is one of the advantages to like being the president is that you can just volunteer people for stuff.
Yeah.
Tracie will handle that for you. Thank you.
Yeah,
very much. But you are.
Yeah, I already was talking to him about doing an article. So.
I'm sure there's some fan of the show out there who just asked, "Did he say Dayglow Abortions?" And yeah, and I didn't just make the name up. It's a real band, and there's a song of theirs called "Hide the Hamster" that I don't recommend anybody ever listen to. It's not, although it is funny.
So who else is loaded?
Brian from Georgia.
Joe is calling you now, and we'll get to you shortly. Quick reminder:
Okay.
Pluckers.
He's
Okay,
here.
cool. Brian, you on?
I'm here.
How are you?
Hi, Brian.
Hey, everybody. I watch this show all the time, and I really like your show. But, I do have lots of religious discussions with people, and most times there's a lot of confusion about the terminology, what it means to be an atheist, what it means to be agnostic, or a theist or a deist. And so I was wondering if you two could clarify each of those terms and maybe tell the audience and viewers what it means to be a strong atheist and why you are a strong atheist. I grew up in a Christian home, so I know what it's like to live a Christian lifestyle. But while it's a wonderful lifestyle, when I tried to, much like Matt, when I tried to validate it using logic, using reason, using everything else we know about the world, I couldn't come to validate it. I could not come to accept it as truth, and I had to reject it consequently. But I was wondering if you all could clarify those terms for the viewers.
Sure. A theist is somebody who believes in a god. An atheist doesn't. An atheist, that doesn't necessarily mean they believe there's no God, although they could. And an agnostic, well, it depends on what kind of agnostic you're talking about. I find the term to be largely useless, and I know that pisses off all kinds of people who would prefer to use that label. I think it's useless because at the core of it, you're saying, I don't know. Well, okay, I'm asking what you believe. I mean, basically, by what most people mean by agnosticism, they're atheists. Because theism is the positive, the position of positively having a belief. I believe X. And anything other than that qualifies as atheism, at least according to my definitions.
Right.
The strong atheist position is one where you believe that there is no God. I'm a strong atheist. I actually believe there is no God. I have no idea who else is or isn't, or whether or not they agree with those definitions. I believe there is no God. Now, do I make this claim and say that I'm convinced there's absolutely no God, or that I'm absolutely convinced? No.
So you're basically talking about relative terms.
Yeah.
You're not talking about absolute knowledge or absolute truth.
Nope. I reject claims of absolute certainty outside of
and that's what I do.
experiential,
That's
esoteric,
exactly
and
what I
logical
do.
absolutes. Yeah.
And
Okay.
you had also asked to explain why. Like, why would I be a strong atheist?
Why would anyone want to be a strong atheist?
I would be a strong atheist for the same reason I would strongly say that I don't believe that fairies exist. If I can say that I do not believe fairies exist, or that fairies do not exist, I can say God does not exist with the same conviction, because there is no more evidence for either. So if I find it interesting that nobody chastises me for saying that there's no such thing as fairies, and yet if I say there's no such thing as God, I get all kinds of, how can you make such a declarative statement? Well, how come you don't think it's weird that I say there's no such... I don't mean you, but like when people ask me this, why don't I get criticism for saying there's no such thing as fairies?
Yeah. And it's... And I couldn't possibly agree more. It's one thing for somebody to say, let's take the God thing out of it, use the analogy. Person A says, I believe in fairies. They are the fairy equivalent of a theist. And anybody who doesn't say, I believe in fairies, is the fairy equivalent of an atheist. I'm not only an atheist. I'm a strong atheist, or perhaps an anti-theist if you wanted. And I'm that way for fairies. I don't just not accept the claim fairies are real. I accept the claim fairies aren't real.
Right.
Because not only is there no evidence to support the claim fairies are real, all the evidence we've ever found supports the claim fairies aren't real. I mean, that people have faked it. We understand more and more about how human thought processes work and how we try to assuage our ignorance with whatever explanation we can plug in there. And everything leads me to the conclusion that the most rational explanation is that fairies don't actually exist. Somebody made this up. It is something that has entered the culture as a meme, and it is progressed, and people have believed or not believed. And I think this applies to fairies and gremlins and leprechauns and mermaids and Bigfoot and Loch Ness Monster and gods. And matter of fact, I'm getting more and more kind of bothered when we use the term in the singular, because then it sounds like we're addressing a specific one.
Right.
I'll be happy to address any specific one that somebody wants to specifically define. Until then, by and large, the gods thing just is made up, in my opinion. However, there are people out there, well, you're holding an irrational position, then you can't know that there aren't any such thing as gods. You're right, and I can't know that there aren't fairies, because when you're using no in that sense, you're saying that I can't be absolutely certain that my claim is true, which is something I never claimed at all, never asserted. On the other hand, I don't have the burden of proof. I do if I'm trying to convince you, for example, if I say fairies don't exist, and I'm trying to convince you to that strong position, I have the burden of proof. And the same is true if I was trying to convince people gods don't exist. I don't adopt that position on the show or talk about it, because all that does is it does the same thing as we were talking about earlier when you say I can neither prove nor disprove. It sets up a false dichotomy that ignores the burden of proof. The burden of proof is on the claimant. And if I'm making a claim and trying to convince you, I would have the burden of proof. But when we're talking about claims of existence, existential claims of this is real, then the assumption is not X exists until we prove it wrong. Otherwise, we'd believe everything. It's nothing exists until it is demonstrable.
I did also want your opinion on blue laws. In a lot of places you can't buy or sell alcohol.
Yeah.
You can't have horse races. You can't buy or sell automobiles. What if my religion said, hey, on Tuesdays, Tuesdays being holy, no one's allowed to buy fish. No one's allowed to buy bubble gum. That would simply just be silly. That would be absurd.
Yep.
Yet this is exactly what happens. For some reason, Sunday is supposed to be a special day where certain people can't do certain things because of someone else's religion.
Well, which is funny, because there is nothing in the Bible that says don't sell alcohol on Sunday.
Yeah.
So I don't even know where it comes from.
And it actually happened. There's more prohibitions in Judaism regarding the Sabbath, so it would probably make more sense for Saturday. What we've done in this country at least, is combine them both in a Judeo-Christian fashion and say Saturdays and Sundays are off limits, but Sundays more so for X, Y, and Z. It's all patently absurd. We don't execute people between sundown on Friday and sunup Monday, or actually 12:01 Monday, so that we don't violate anybody's Sabbath. We're not the books that claim eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, put everybody to death no matter what they've done, spawned these religions, and in deference to them, we're not going to exercise our capital punishments on the Jewish Sabbath or the Christian Sabbath. How frickin' stupid is that?
Well, see, the way I see it is, it's one thing, to choose not to participate in these activities on your chosen day. If you choose not to do these things on Sunday, go right ahead. But why would you want to limit, or why would someone be able to limit someone else's freedoms of an entire state?
Yep.
At the expense of one person's beliefs?
Yeah.
I am of the opinion that blue laws are unconstitutional.
Okay.
And
they are.
And insane.
Okay, well, thank you guys for
Thanks
taking my call.
And while Joe goes ahead and gets us ready for the next caller, there's like about 10 minutes, actually less, since we have to stop 90 seconds earlier, left in the show. There's an email that went around this week that I wanted to address super briefly that was about parents complaining about a modern art sculpture of DNA and how that they had to answer. That's Poe, folks. For the people who sent it to me, the real objection was about a modern art sculpture of an actual nude man and nude woman. And what they did was they took the information from that article and glommed it into another one and put a sculpture of DNA in there and then rewrote it so that it looked like they were complaining about a DNA sculpture. However, whether that's Poe or not, the absurdity, I've seen the male and female sculptures. They're kind of abstract, whatever, but they're obviously nude figures. We have nude figures everywhere all the time. I mean, we're going to dump all the ancient Greek marble statues that we've got laying around, or that Greece has laying around. Look out, Greece, we're coming for your statues.
Well, they actually did go around and deface them.
And Ashcroft covered up the breasts on justice. Boy, if that's not a statement about justice, I don't know what is. It doesn't matter whether they were complaining about a modern art DNA sculpture, as the Poe version suggested, or modern art naked people. They're a bunch of stick-up-their-butt morons who are so concerned, so eager to find something to be offended about, that it's
if only it could have
mind-boggling.
been a statue of violence instead.
Yeah. Gosh, I really wish you hadn't put up that statue, whatever. Anyway, who's next?
Another Joe from South Florida.
Another Joe from South Florida. Is this a guy from Delray Beach?
Yes.
Yes.
How you doing, Joe?
Very good, thank you. How are you guys doing?
Good, thanks.
Hungry.
Anyway, I happened to be on YouTube, and I stumbled upon a video of a Christian who was talking about how he didn't believe that homosexuals should be, why he didn't like homosexuals. And he used the infamous Leviticus verse,
Sure.
and, and after the video I said, well, okay, well, this is his opinion, and, I respect him for that. And then like
I'd
a few
phrase it
weeks
different,
later,
but I'm
he
with
makes two different videos where he finds out that, do you know what Axe body spray is?
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
Anyway,
It cracks
he
me
makes-
up. I'm sorry. It's just the Axe commercials crack me up.
The Axe commercials are probably the most heterosexually absurd commercials ever. But go ahead.
Anyway, he makes videos saying that he found out that homosexuals have started using the Axe body spray more, and he's going off on this wild rant, and he actually decided to write a letter to the Axe company.
Okay, stop. Joe,
Yeah.
put the YouTube down.
Huh?
Put the YouTube down. Step away from the machine. Not every nut job on YouTube needs a response.
Okay.
I mean, I'll let you go ahead and get to whatever point you're making. I just had to interject that because I get so much email that says, hey, would you go look at this video? And I go over there and literally I'm watching 30 seconds of some guy who's crazy, who has... they don't reserve a response from anyone at all because it raises the level, or it raises them up to something that we should comment on. If somebody's going to get upset because they're a homophobe and they found out that some homosexuals are using Axe body spray and now they're starting a letter writing campaign and posting a YouTube video, I mean that reminds me of the woman who videotaped her garden hose making rainbows and claiming, I don't know. Anyway, it's just nuts. But go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to say that I just don't like the fact how Christians take actions based on their beliefs.
Which is the whole reason that I spend a lot of time trying to point out that we take actions based on our beliefs, and those actions have consequences, and therefore it's in all of our best interests to try to make sure that we have right beliefs, and by that I don't mean orthodox beliefs. I mean beliefs that are consistent and correct with regard to reality.
Justifiable.
Yeah.
And,
it's so
while
annoying.
While I understand your frustration, I also have to say that the unfortunate reality is that this is their freedom.
Yeah.
I mean, they are free to complain or to boycott or whatever they want to do, and unfortunately that can sometimes drive people out of business, ruin somebody's life and livelihood. It happens. And it's unfortunate that, like Matt's saying, that this would be done from the foundation of an irrational belief system. But that is the real pain that comes from a society where a lot of people believe crazy things.
Does this guy allow comments on his videos?
Oh, yes.
Okay. Then all you need to do is post that you've heard that some homosexuals are reading the Bible and see if he wants to, send a letter to the author of the Bible about that.
All right. Well, thank you, guys. And,
Sure.
And I will put the YouTube down.
Yes.
All right.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you.
And I say that mostly joking. You can go ahead and get one more if it's a quick one.
Wilhelm from Sweden.
Yeah, sure.
Sure.
Wilhelm.
I get so much email, and I desperately want to answer all of it. And for the longest time, I did a really good job of answering almost all of it. And then the other day, I had like 400 that I just archived because either somebody else had answered or there's no way I was going to get to it, and I didn't want to be answering an email that somebody sent me 2 months ago. And some of them are, hey, go watch this video and tell me what you think, or I couldn't come up with an answer to this video, can you? And I do my best. Sometimes I answer those, even when I'd really rather say, oh my gosh, go read a book.
I had to just send a link at one point. Someone wrote in and said, animals have no compassion and they just eat one another or something. And I just sent him a link showing him that, animals have compassion. I don't know what to,
let
there's
me
no
Google
response.
that for you, But
Yeah.
Anyway, we got Wilhelm from Sweden.
Hello?
Hello, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks.
You're going to have to be quick.
Anyway, I was just wanted to ask about a few things concerning the Bible.
You have 1 minute.
Yeah, it's really quick. I encountered someone who argued from Romans 10:4 that that was the reason why the Old Testament laws didn't matter anymore. And I don't know, perhaps you could answer some other time.
I'll give you my cop-out answer really quick. If you have somebody who's arguing from Romans, you have somebody who's arguing from the Bible. And all you have to do is ask, why on earth should we take that authority? Okay, so you're going to use the Bible, this part of the Bible, to say, this is why this part of the Bible doesn't apply before. Okay, that's really interesting. Now tell me why I should think any of it applies at all. What is it about the Bible? Can you demonstrate that why should I take this as authoritative, as reliable, as a reason for making a decision about anything?
Also, let me just throw out Acts. I think it's Acts 17 and Acts 21. Maybe Acts 15 talks a little bit about the laws applying.
Yeah. And actually, and Matthew, but I mean, it's the big book, multiple choice. You can pick and choose. We got like 45 seconds. I apologize. We got to let you go. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in. We'll be back again next week. I'm not sure who's on. We're going to keep doing it from Dillahunty International Studios until the other studio is ready. For those of you in the Austin area, you're welcome to join us at Pluckers up at Lakeline. Thanks to Frank and Joe for coming down this week, and Frank especially for all the extra stuff. Thanks to the people who emailed and advised that we get a compressor. Hopefully, at least our audio sounds better. We'll work more on the Skype stuff. And we'll see you next week. Take care.